October 24, 1944, Philippine Sea, approximately 200 miles northeast of Leyte. Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, studying intelligence reports that should have filled him with confidence, but instead left him deeply unsettled. American radio intercepts suggested massive carrier formations approaching from multiple directions, numbers that seemed impossible even by American standards. His staff officers assured him the reports were exaggerated, perhaps deliberate misinformation. The Americans, they calculated, could not possibly have more than 60 operational aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific. Their industrial capacity, while impressive, had limits that Japanese naval intelligence had carefully studied and documented. What Admiral Kurita could not have known as he prepared for what would become the largest naval battle in human history was that American shipyards had already delivered 99 light carriers to the Pacific Fleet, with more launching every month. The mathematical assumptions that had guided Japanese strategic planning since Pearl Harbor were about to collide with an industrial reality that would shatter the Imperial Navy's confidence in victory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese dismissal of American carrier construction capabilities had deep roots in their own experience and cultural assumptions. In 1941, when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese naval intelligence estimated that American shipyards might produce 20 to 30 aircraft carriers during a prolonged war. This estimate was based on the time required to build Japanese carriers and the assumption that American construction would follow similar patterns. The Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku had required nearly 3 years to construct, from keel laying in December 1937 to commissioning in August 1941. The ship represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, incorporating lessons learned from earlier carrier designs and featuring sophisticated armor protection and aircraft handling systems. Japanese naval architects designed their carriers as individual works of engineering excellence, each ship carefully crafted with unique improvements and modifications. The process required skilled craftsmen, specialized materials, and meticulous attention to detail that reflected Japan's traditional approach to industrial production. When Admiral Yamamoto's staff calculated American production potential, they applied Japanese construction timelines to American shipyards. If Japan could build perhaps 2 fleet carriers per year at maximum effort, they reasoned, America, with its larger industrial base, might manage 5 or 6 annually. Even doubling that estimate to account for American mass production techniques suggested perhaps 12 carriers per year. These calculations seemed generous, even optimistic, when measured against Japanese experience. What they failed to account for was a fundamental difference in American industrial philosophy that would revolutionize naval construction. While Japanese shipyards emphasized individual excellence and traditional craftsmanship, American yards were preparing to apply assembly line techniques to warship construction on an unprecedented scale. The transformation began before Pearl Harbor at shipyards across the United States. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn, and Fall River Shipyard in Massachusetts began implementing mass production techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Instead of building ships sequentially from keel to commissioning, American yards started prefabricating major sections simultaneously. Henry J. Kaiser, whose shipyards would revolutionize merchant vessel construction with Liberty ships, was simultaneously developing techniques for rapid warship production. The lessons learned building cargo vessels at unprecedented speed would soon be applied to aircraft carriers, transforming what had been a craft industry into mass production. The catalyst came with the Essex-class carrier program, authorized by Congress in 1940 and expanded dramatically after Pearl Harbor. The Essex design prioritized standardization over individual optimization. Rather than creating unique ships like Japanese practice, American naval architects developed a basic template that could be replicated efficiently across multiple shipyards. Newport News Shipbuilding pioneered the techniques that would define American carrier construction. Workers prefabricated hull sections in workshops while the keel was being laid. Flight deck sections were assembled separately and lowered into place by massive cranes. Propulsion systems were installed as complete units, rather than built piece by piece. The result was a production timeline that would have seemed impossible to Japanese observers. USS Essex, the lead ship of her class, required only 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Subsequent ships in the class would be completed even faster as workers gained experience and techniques improved. But the Essex class represented only the beginning of American carrier production. Recognizing that fleet carriers alone could not provide the numerical superiority needed for simultaneous operations across the vast Pacific, American planners developed an entirely new category of warship that would multiply their effective strength exponentially. The Independence-class light carriers emerged from desperate necessity and brilliant innovation. Rather than building new hulls specifically designed as carriers, naval architects converted existing Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls already under construction. The conversion process transformed ships designed for surface warfare into operational aircraft carriers in approximately half the time required for purpose-built vessels. 9 Independence-class carriers were converted from cruiser hulls, each capable of operating approximately 30 aircraft. While smaller than fleet carriers, they provided the numerical strength needed for the multi-front war that American strategy demanded. More importantly, they proved the concept that would drive the next phase of American carrier production. The breakthrough came with the development of escort carriers, small vessels built on merchant ship hulls specifically designed for mass production. These ships, dismissed by Japanese naval officers as inferior to real carriers, would ultimately outnumber all other aircraft carriers combined in the American fleet. Kaiser Shipbuilding, applying the same mass production techniques used for Liberty ships, began launching escort carriers at rates that defied traditional naval construction timelines. The basic design could be completed in approximately 6 months from keel laying to commissioning, with some ships delivered even faster as production techniques improved. The Casablanca-class escort carriers became the foundation of American numerical superiority at sea. 50 ships of this class alone were built by Kaiser Shipbuilding between 1942 and 1944. Each could operate approximately 28 aircraft, providing tactical flexibility that allowed American commanders to deploy air power wherever needed across multiple theaters simultaneously. Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring American ship launches through various sources, initially dismissed escort carriers as training vessels or convoy escorts unsuitable for fleet operations. The ships appeared smaller and less sophisticated than Japanese fleet carriers, leading to assumptions that they represented desperate measures rather than deliberate strategy. What Japanese analysts failed to understand was that American naval doctrine had evolved to embrace quantity as its own form of quality. Rather than concentrating air power in a few heavily protected fleet carriers, American planners distributed aircraft across dozens of platforms that could absorb losses while maintaining operational capability. The mathematical implications became staggering as American production accelerated. In 1943 alone, American shipyards delivered 25 aircraft carriers of various types to the Pacific Fleet. The following year would see even greater numbers as production lines reached maximum efficiency and additional shipyards came online. By mid-1944, as Admiral Kurita prepared for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf, American carrier strength in the Pacific had reached levels that Japanese pre-war planning had considered impossible. Task Force 38, under Admiral William Halsey, operated 16 fleet and light carriers. Task Force 77, under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, deployed 18 escort carriers, specifically for the Leyte operation. The numbers represented more than mere quantity. Each carrier, regardless of size, brought trained aircrew, sophisticated radar systems, and coordinated tactical doctrine that multiplied their effectiveness. American pilot training programs had expanded to match ship production, creating a pipeline of qualified aviators that could replace combat losses while maintaining operational strength. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, had suffered catastrophic losses in earlier battles that could not be replaced. The experienced pilots who had achieved early victories at Pearl Harbor and in the Dutch East Indies had been killed or wounded in battles of attrition that Japan could not sustain. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training that left them inadequately prepared for combat against increasingly experienced American aviators. The industrial, Comparison revealed fundamental differences in strategic approach. Japan had concentrated its limited industrial capacity on producing smaller numbers of high-quality vessels and aircraft. Each Zero fighter represented months of skilled labor and scarce materials. Each fleet carrier embodied years of construction, effort, and irreplaceable expertise. America had chosen a different path, applying mass production techniques to create overwhelming numerical superiority. American fighters might be individually inferior to Japanese aircraft in some characteristics, but they were available in quantities that allowed tactical flexibility and acceptable loss rates. American carriers might lack some of the sophisticated features of Japanese vessels, but their numbers provided strategic redundancy that no amount of individual excellence could counter. The escort carrier program illustrated this philosophy perfectly. A single Japanese fleet carrier like Shokaku could theoretically outfight any American escort carrier in individual combat, but American production delivered 50 Casablanca-class ships for every Shokaku-class carrier Japan managed to complete. The mathematical advantage was insurmountable. Admiral Kurita understood these realities better than many of his contemporaries as he approached the decisive battle. Intelligence reports from earlier engagements had revealed American carrier strength that exceeded Japanese estimates by factors that seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. American task forces operated with carrier concentrations that Japanese planning had never anticipated. The transformation in the balance of naval power had occurred with stunning speed. In December 1941, Japan possessed the world's most experienced naval aviation force, operating from modern aircraft carriers with proven tactical doctrine. 3 years later, that same force faced American carrier task forces numbering in the dozens, supported by industrial production that could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was profound and demoralizing. They had entered the war confident in their technological and tactical superiority, believing that American industrial capacity, while large, could not overcome the advantages of experience and individual excellence. The reality they now faced suggested that quantity, when sufficiently overwhelming, became its own form of quality. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, commanding the Japanese Northern Force at Leyte Gulf, had witnessed this transformation firsthand during earlier battles in the Philippine Sea. His carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, now operated with skeleton air groups and inexperienced pilots against American task forces that seemed to multiply with each engagement. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 had demonstrated the futility of Japanese carrier operations against American numerical superiority. Ozawa's 9 carriers had launched massive airstrikes against American task forces, only to see their aircraft shot down in such numbers that American pilots nicknamed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American radar-directed fighter interceptions, coordinated by experienced controllers aboard multiple carriers, had destroyed Japanese air power with mechanical efficiency. The loss of approximately 600 aircraft and most of their trained pilots represented a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never recover. Yet the most demoralizing aspect of the Philippine Sea battle had been the American response to Japanese attacks. Where Japanese losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable, American task forces absorbed damage and continued operations with apparent ease. Ships were repaired, aircraft were replaced, and pilots continued flying as if the massive air battles had been routine training exercises. The industrial foundation supporting American naval operations had become visible to Japanese commanders in ways that numbers alone could not convey. Every American task force operated with fleet trains carrying spare aircraft, replacement parts, fuel, ammunition, and provisions that allowed sustained operations far from base ports. Japanese carriers, by contrast, required frequent returns to major naval facilities for replenishment and repair. American shipyards had not only produced the carriers themselves, but had created an entire supporting infrastructure of auxiliary vessels that multiplied operational capability. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, and transport craft allowed American task forces to remain at sea for weeks or months while maintaining combat effectiveness. The Japanese naval strategy that had achieved stunning victories in 1941 and early 1942 had been based on decisive battle doctrine inherited from Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905. Japanese planners believed that superior training, equipment, and tactics could achieve victory through single, climactic engagements that would decide the war's outcome. This doctrine had worked brilliantly when Japanese forces possessed qualitative superiority and faced enemies with comparable numerical strength. Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies campaign, and early victories in the Solomon Islands had validated Japanese assumptions about the effectiveness of concentrated power applied at decisive points. But American industrial mobilization had fundamentally altered the strategic equation. Rather than seeking single decisive battles, American planners could afford to fight campaigns of attrition that would favor the side with superior production capacity. Each engagement that cost both sides, aircraft and pilots, ultimately favored America, which could replace losses while Japan could not. The escort carrier program exemplified this strategic approach. These ships were not designed to win individual battles against Japanese fleet carriers. Instead, they were intended to provide persistent air cover for amphibious operations, anti-submarine warfare, and convoy protection across multiple theaters simultaneously. By 1944, escort carriers were operating in every ocean where American forces were engaged. They provided air support for landings in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the Philippines. They hunted submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific. They transported replacement aircraft to forward bases and fleet carriers. Their individual capabilities might be modest, but their collective impact was transformational. The production numbers told a story that Japanese intelligence struggled to accept, even when confronted with undeniable evidence. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards would deliver 147 aircraft carriers of all types to the fleet. This total included 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 114 escort carriers of various designs. Japanese production during the same period managed to complete only 14 aircraft carriers, including conversions of existing hulls. The production ratio of more than 10-to-1 represented industrial superiority that no amount of tactical skill or individual courage could overcome. The human dimension of this production achievement was equally remarkable. American shipyards employed hundreds of thousands of workers, including many women and minorities who had been excluded from heavy industry before the war. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol of American industrial mobilization, but she represented millions of real workers whose efforts made unprecedented production possible. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, remained dependent on traditional skilled craftsmen whose expertise could not be quickly replicated or expanded. The bombing of Japanese industrial cities and the diversion of materials to other military priorities further constrained carrier production as the war progressed. The technological gap also widened as American industry applied mass production techniques to innovation. Radar systems, communication equipment, and aircraft that had been experimental in 1941 became standard equipment on American carriers by 1944. Each new ship incorporated improvements learned from combat experience and technological advancement. American carriers launched in 1944 carried radar systems more sophisticated than those available to any other navy. Their aircraft operated with radio communication, navigation aids, and weapons systems that provided tactical advantages beyond mere numbers. Pilots flew with equipment that increased their effectiveness and survival rates while reducing the training time needed to achieve combat proficiency. The cumulative effect of superior numbers, better equipment, and sustainable replacement rates created American naval superiority that grew stronger with each engagement. Japanese forces, fighting with declining resources and irreplaceable losses, faced an enemy that became more powerful over time rather than weaker. As Admiral Kurita approached the waters off Leyte in October 1944, he commanded the largest Japanese surface force assembled since the war's beginning. The center force included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 9 18-inch guns and armor protection designed to resist any weapon then known. 5 other battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers represented the concentrated might of the Imperial Navy. Yet Kurita understood that his impressive surface fleet faced an enemy that had fundamentally altered the nature of naval warfare. The aircraft carriers that Japanese admirals had once dismissed as auxiliary vessels had become the dominant weapons system at sea. And America possessed those carriers in numbers that Japanese pre-war planning had considered impossible. The intelligence reports reaching Japanese commanders painted a picture of American naval strength that challenged every assumption about industrial capacity and strategic possibility. Task Force 38 alone operated more aircraft carriers than Japan had possessed at the height of its power. The escort carriers supporting the Leyte landings outnumbered the entire Japanese carrier force remaining in service. More troubling than the raw numbers was the evidence of systematic American tactical doctrine that treated aircraft carriers as expendable weapons rather than precious assets to be carefully conserved. American task forces operated with aggressive confidence that suggested they could absorb losses while maintaining operational capability. Japanese naval doctrine, developed during an era of resource scarcity and industrial limitation, emphasized preservation of fleet assets and decisive engagement under favorable conditions. Every ship lost represented capabilities that could not be readily replaced. Every pilot killed meant experience that required years to rebuild. American naval operations in 1944 demonstrated a fundamentally different approach. Losses were accepted as inevitable and acceptable if they contributed to overall strategic objectives. Ships damaged beyond economical repair were simply abandoned while replacement vessels arrived from American shipyards. Pilots shot down were mourned but quickly replaced by new graduates from expanded training programs. This casual attitude toward losses, which Japanese officers initially interpreted as evidence of American waste and inefficiency, actually reflected industrial strength so overwhelming that individual assets became tactically disposable. The escort carrier that might be sunk today could be replaced by 2 new ships launching next month. The realization that America could afford to lose carriers faster than Japan could sink them represented a profound psychological shock to Japanese naval leadership. Traditional concepts of naval warfare assumed that both sides valued their major vessels and would seek to preserve them through careful maneuvering and advantageous engagement. But when one side possessed 100 carriers and the other retained fewer than 10, traditional assumptions about fleet preservation became irrelevant. America could afford tactical mistakes, operational losses, and even strategic setbacks because industrial production provided constant reinforcement and replacement. The mathematical reality facing Japanese planners in October 1944 was stark and undeniable. Even if Japanese forces achieved impossible success ratios, sinking American carriers at rates of 5 or 10 to 1, American production could replace losses while Japanese losses were permanent and irreplaceable. Admiral Kurita's approach to Leyte represented Japan's last realistic opportunity to achieve decisive victory through superior tactical performance. The center force included the most powerful surface combatants ever built, manned by experienced crews and commanded by officers with decades of professional preparation. Yet success would require more than tactical excellence. Japanese forces would need to locate, engage, and destroy American carrier task forces that possessed every advantage of numbers, technology, and industrial support. The odds against achieving such success had grown steadily worse with each month of American production and Japanese attrition. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally resolve the question that had haunted Japanese strategic planning since Pearl Harbor. Could superior training, equipment, and tactics overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage backed by limitless industrial capacity? The answer would come in the waters off Leyte, where Japanese admirals would discover whether American claims about 100 carrier fleets represented propaganda or reality. The mathematics of industrial warfare were about to receive their ultimate test in the largest naval battle ever fought. October 25, 1944, 06:30 hours, Leyte Gulf. Admiral Clifton Sprague stood on the bridge of the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, watching his radar operators track what appeared to be the entire Japanese battle fleet approaching from the north. His task unit, 77.4.3, nicknamed Taffy 3, consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The most powerful weapon under his command was a 5-inch gun. Racing toward them at 24 knots came Admiral Kurita's center force, the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 5 additional battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The Japanese force mounted more than 100 major caliber guns, some of them 18-inch monsters, that could obliterate an escort carrier with a single hit. In any rational calculation, Taffy 3 faced annihilation within minutes. The escort carriers could manage 17 knots maximum speed and possessed no armor protection against battleship gunfire. Their aircraft were configured for ground support missions with general-purpose bombs, rather than armor-piercing weapons needed to damage heavy warships. Yet Admiral Sprague did not panic or attempt to flee. Instead, he ordered his carriers to launch every available aircraft, while his destroyers and destroyer escorts charged directly at the Japanese battleships in what should have been a suicidal attack. His decision was based on a crucial understanding that Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp. Taffy 3 was not alone. The escort carriers under attack represented only a fraction of American naval strength concentrated around Leyte. Task Force 38, with its 16 fleet and light carriers, operated 200 miles to the east. Additional escort carrier groups provided air support for amphibious operations across multiple beachheads. The total American carrier strength in Philippine waters approached 40 ships, more aircraft carriers than Japan had possessed at any single time during the entire war. What Admiral Kurita encountered in the pre-dawn darkness was not the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine sought, but a demonstration of industrial warfare that made traditional naval concepts obsolete. Every American task unit he engaged represented capabilities that could be replaced, reinforced, or supplemented by forces whose scale exceeded Japanese comprehension. The mathematics of the engagement revealed the transformation that American production had achieved. Taffy 3's 6 escort carriers embarked approximately 150 aircraft total. Task Force 38 operated more than 1,000 aircraft from its fleet carriers. The combined American air strength around Leyte exceeded 1,500 aircraft, more than the entire Japanese Naval Air Force remaining in service. But numbers alone did not tell the complete story. American aircraft launched that morning carried weapons, navigation equipment, and communication systems that represented technological advantages as decisive as numerical superiority. Pilots flew with radar-equipped fighters, torpedo bombers with sophisticated targeting systems, and dive bombers with precision bomb sights that increased accuracy while reducing exposure to defensive fire. The Japanese battleships and cruisers that had seemed so formidable approaching at dawn found themselves under attack by coordinated airstrikes that materialized from multiple directions simultaneously. Aircraft from Taffy 3 initiated the assault with whatever weapons they carried, including depth charges and general-purpose bombs, never intended for use against armored warships. More devastating attacks followed as Admiral Halsey's task. Force 38, alerted by radio calls from the embattled escort carriers, launched massive strikes against Kurita's fleet. The air groups that reached the Japanese formation represented industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could deploy. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo aircraft pressed home attacks, while fighter escorts maintained air superiority over the engagement area. Admiral Kurita, watching American aircraft appear in seemingly inexhaustible numbers, faced a revelation that shattered every calculation underlying Japanese naval strategy. The intelligence estimates that had suggested America might operate 60 carriers in the Pacific were proving catastrophically conservative. Evidence was mounting that American carrier strength approached or exceeded 100 ships, exactly as American propaganda had claimed. The attack on the super battleship Musashi illustrated the futility of individual excellence against overwhelming numbers. The ship had been designed as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval architecture, mounting 9 18-inch guns behind armor protection up to 26 inches thick. No single American aircraft carried weapons capable of penetrating that armor or inflicting decisive damage. Yet over 5 hours of continuous air attacks more than 200 American aircraft struck Musashi with bombs and torpedoes that gradually overwhelmed even her massive defensive systems. The ship absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally capsizing, taking with her over 1,000 officers and men whose training and experience could never be replaced. The loss of Musashi represented more than the destruction of a single ship. The vessel embodied years of construction effort, irreplaceable materials, and expertise that Japan's constrained industrial base could not duplicate. Her sinking demonstrated that American industrial capacity could generate sufficient air power to destroy any target, regardless of armor, protection, or defensive capability. More troubling for Japanese commanders was the casual manner in which American forces absorbed their own losses while maintaining operational effectiveness. Several escort carriers suffered damage from Japanese gunfire, and dozens of aircraft were shot down during the attacks on Kurita's fleet. Yet American operations continued without apparent degradation in capability or morale. The USS Gambier Bay, sunk by Japanese cruiser gunfire during the surface engagement, represented exactly the kind of loss that American industrial planning had anticipated and accepted. The ship and her crew were mourned, but replacement escort carriers were already launching from Kaiser shipyards while the battle continued. American strategic calculations had incorporated acceptable loss rates that Japanese planners found incomprehensible. Japanese naval doctrine, developed during an era of scarcity and careful resource management, could not accommodate losses on the scale that American industry made routine. Every major warship lost meant capabilities that required years to rebuild. Every experienced crew member killed represented training investments that could not be quickly replicated. American naval operations demonstrated a fundamentally different relationship between individual assets and overall capability. Ships, aircraft, and even trained personnel were treated as components in a vast system that could function effectively despite significant local losses. The industrial foundation supporting this system generated replacements faster than combat could inflict damage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The afternoon phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf brought Japanese forces into contact with additional American task units that confirmed their worst fears about carrier proliferation. Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, intended to decoy American carriers away from the main battle area, encountered Task Force 38 in what should have been favorable circumstances for Japanese tactical doctrine. Ozawa commanded 4 aircraft carriers, including the fleet carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and numerous Pacific battles. His force represented the last operational carrier strength remaining to the Imperial Navy, manned by the most experienced officers still available for sea duty. If any Japanese formation could achieve tactical success against American carrier forces, it should have been Ozawa's carefully preserved units. The engagement that followed demolished Japanese assumptions about the possibility of achieving local superiority against American naval forces. Task Force 38 launched coordinated strikes by more than 500 aircraft against Ozawa's 4 carriers, while maintaining sufficient reserves to defend against Japanese counterattacks. The scale of American air operations exceeded anything Japanese commanders had witnessed during earlier battles. Previous engagements had involved American task forces, operating 50 to 100 aircraft per carrier, numbers that Japanese intelligence had considered normal. The strikes against Ozawa's force revealed American carriers operating aircraft in densities that suggested fundamental changes in aviation, logistics, and deck handling procedures. American escort carriers had been designed around the concept of flexible air group composition that allowed rapid adaptation to tactical requirements. Rather than operating fixed squadrons of specific aircraft types, American carriers could embark whatever combination of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes the tactical situation demanded. This flexibility multiplied effective American strength by allowing concentration of specific aircraft types where needed most. Carriers supporting amphibious operations could embark additional fighters for air superiority missions. Those engaged in anti-shipping operations could increase torpedo bomber strength. The ability to reconfigure air groups rapidly gave American commanders tactical options that rigid Japanese squadron structures could not match. The technology gap had also widened dramatically since the war's early battles. American aircraft launching in October 1944 carried radar systems, improved engines, and weapons that provided decisive advantages over Japanese equivalents. The F-6F Hellcat fighters that escorted American strike groups possessed performance characteristics that made Japanese Zero fighters obsolete, except under the most favorable circumstances. More important than individual aircraft performance was the systematic American approach to air warfare that treated aviation as an industrial process rather than individual combat. American pilots received standardized training that emphasized tactical coordination and mutual support over individual heroics. Radio communication allowed real-time coordination of complex operations involving hundreds of aircraft. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, had been devastated by cumulative losses that left remaining units with inadequately trained replacement pilots and deteriorating equipment. The experienced aviators who had achieved early victories were mostly dead or wounded. Their replacements received abbreviated training that left them unprepared for combat against increasingly sophisticated American opposition. The destruction of Ozawa's carrier force proceeded with mechanical efficiency that demonstrated American air power operating at industrial scale. Japanese carriers that had once seemed invincible were systematically located, attacked, and sunk by coordinated strikes that overwhelmed defensive measures through sheer volume of attacking aircraft. The carrier Zuikaku, flagship of Admiral Ozawa and veteran of more Pacific battles than any other Japanese warship, absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits before finally sinking in the late afternoon. Her loss marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force and the beginning of American naval supremacy so complete that Japanese surface ships would rarely venture from port during the war's remaining months. Yet the most significant aspect of the Leyte Gulf engagement was not the tactical destruction of Japanese naval forces, but the revelation of American industrial capacity that made such destruction routine and sustainable. Every Japanese ship sunk represented irreplaceable losses that weakened remaining capabilities. Every American ship damaged or lost could be replaced by multiple vessels already under construction. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese officers was profound and demoralizing. They had witnessed firsthand the industrial warfare that American planners had been developing since Pearl Harbor. The 100-carrier fleet that Japanese intelligence had, dismissed as propaganda, was proving to be conservative rather than exaggerated. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw the center force during the afternoon of October 25th reflected this dawning realization that traditional naval tactics had become obsolete against industrial opponents. His surface ships, the most powerful ever built, could not overcome air power generated by dozens of aircraft carriers operating in coordinated task forces. The retreat of the center force marked the effective end of the Imperial Navy as a strategic threat in the Pacific War. Remaining Japanese naval units would be relegated to suicide attacks and coastal defense as American industrial superiority made conventional naval operations impossible for Japan to sustain. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had lasted 4 days and involved more than 200 warships from both sides. When fighting ended on October 26th, Japanese losses included 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses totaled 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The exchange ratio of approximately 4-to-1 in major warships favored America decisively, but the true significance lay in replacement capabilities rather than immediate losses. American shipyards could replace every vessel lost at Leyte Gulf within months, while delivering additional ships that exceeded pre-battle strength. Japanese losses were permanent and irreplaceable given the constraints of their industrial base and available materials. More than ship losses, the battle demonstrated that American claims about 100-carrier fleets represented operational reality rather than propaganda exaggeration. Japanese admirals who had dismissed such claims as impossible had encountered carrier task forces, numbering in the dozens during a single engagement in one theater of a global war. The escort carriers that Japanese intelligence had characterized as training vessels or convoy escorts proved capable of sustained combat operations against major fleet units. Their pilots, flying aircraft dismissed as inferior to Japanese fighters, achieved tactical results that Japanese veterans found incomprehensible given their pre-war assumptions about American capabilities. The industrial foundation supporting American naval operations had become visible to Japanese survivors in ways that tactical analysis alone could not convey. Every American task force operated with sophisticated logistics that allowed sustained operations far from base facilities. Damaged ships received immediate repair attention from mobile facilities that Japanese forces lacked. Replacement aircraft and pilots arrived regularly to maintain unit strength despite combat losses. American radio communications, coordination procedures, and tactical doctrine demonstrated systematic approaches to naval warfare that treated individual battles as components in larger strategic campaigns. Japanese forces, operating with declining resources and irreplaceable personnel, faced opponents who became stronger rather than weaker through sustained combat operations. The implications extended beyond immediate military consequences to fundamental questions about industrial warfare and national survival. Japanese strategic planning had been based on achieving decisive victories that would force negotiated settlements before American industrial advantages could become decisive. The 100-carrier fleet represented the failure of that strategy and the inevitability of ultimate defeat. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the combined fleet from shore headquarters in Japan, understood the strategic implications even before detailed battle reports reached Tokyo. American naval strength demonstrated at Leyte Gulf exceeded Japanese capabilities by margins that no amount of tactical skill or individual sacrifice could overcome. The carrier, production numbers that Japanese intelligence had finally been forced to accept, painted a picture of industrial mobilization beyond their previous comprehension. American shipyards were delivering aircraft carriers at rates exceeding one per week during peak production periods. Japanese yards had managed to complete only 14 carriers during the entire war, while American production approached 150 vessels of all types. The technological and training advantages that had initially favored Japanese forces had been systematically overcome by American industrial investment in equipment, weapons, and personnel development. Radar systems, communication gear, and aircraft that had been experimental in 1941 had become standard equipment throughout American naval forces by 1944. Japanese forces still possessed individual weapons and platforms that might be superior to American equivalents in specific characteristics. But such advantages meant nothing when facing opponents who possessed overwhelming numerical superiority backed by continuous replacement capability. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the moment when mathematical reality finally overcame strategic hope in Japanese naval planning. The 100 carriers that admirals had dismissed as impossible propaganda were demonstrably real and operationally effective. American industrial capacity had transformed the nature of naval warfare in ways that made traditional Japanese advantages irrelevant. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Japanese naval forces that had dominated the Pacific in 1941 faced opponents whose strength grew continuously, while their own capabilities declined through irreplaceable losses. The mathematics of industrial warfare had rendered traditional concepts of naval combat obsolete in favor of production capacity and sustainable replacement rates. November 15, 1944. Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito sat in silence as Admiral Takeo Kurita delivered the final assessment of Japanese naval capabilities following the catastrophe at Leyte Gulf. The combined fleet, which had once dominated the Pacific from the Aleutians to Australia, now consisted of scattered remnants hiding in home waters, lacking fuel, aircraft, and trained crews to conduct meaningful operations. The mathematical reality that Japanese admirals had refused to accept for 3 years was finally undeniable. American shipyards had delivered their 100th aircraft carrier to the Pacific Fleet on November 1, 1944. The USS Anzio, a Casablanca-class escort carrier, had been completed in just over 5 months from keel laying to commissioning, representing industrial capacity that exceeded Japanese comprehension. What began as dismissive laughter at American production claims had ended in the complete destruction of Japanese naval aviation and the effective surrender of the Pacific to enemy. Forces whose strength continued growing while Japan's capabilities collapsed through irreplaceable losses and industrial exhaustion. The emperor's questions were simple and devastating. How had intelligence estimates proven so catastrophically wrong? Why had American industrial capacity exceeded every Japanese calculation? Could any strategy have succeeded against opponents capable of building carriers faster than submarines could sink them? Admiral Toyoda's answers revealed the systematic failures that had doomed Japanese naval strategy from Pearl Harbor onward. Japanese intelligence had measured American capabilities using Japanese limitations, assuming that construction techniques, resource allocation, and industrial organization would follow patterns familiar from their own experience. The fundamental error was cultural as much as technical. Japanese naval construction emphasized individual excellence and traditional craftsmanship that produced superior ships in small numbers. American industry had chosen mass production techniques that generated adequate ships in overwhelming quantities, transforming naval warfare from individual combat to industrial attrition. The escort carriers that Japanese officers had dismissed as inferior training vessels proved decisive not through individual capability, but through collective impact. By November 1944, American escort carriers alone outnumbered all Japanese aircraft carriers ever completed by ratios exceeding 5-1. More devastating than numbers was the systematic American approach to naval aviation that treated aircraft and pilots as industrial products rather than irreplaceable assets. Japanese training programs had produced exceptional individual aviators through lengthy instruction that could not be rapidly expanded. American programs emphasized standardized procedures that allowed quick training of adequate pilots in massive numbers. The result was sustainable aviation capability that could absorb combat losses while maintaining operational strength. Japanese naval aviation, after suffering catastrophic pilot losses in earlier battles, operated with inexperienced replacement crews who lacked the skills needed for effective combat against increasingly sophisticated American opposition. The technological gap had also widened as American industrial capacity applied mass production to innovation. Radar systems, communication equipment, and aircraft that had been experimental in 1941 became standard throughout American forces by 1944. Japanese forces still relied primarily on equipment designed before the war, with minimal technological advancement due to resource constraints and industrial limitations. The post-war interrogation of surviving Japanese naval officers revealed the psychological impact of confronting industrial warfare beyond their conceptual framework. Captain Tamechi Hara, one of the few destroyer commanders to survive multiple engagements, described the transformation in American naval capability as a fundamental change in the nature of warfare itself. Early battles had featured opponents with comparable numbers using similar equipment and tactics. Individual skill, superior training, and tactical innovation could achieve decisive results. But American industrial mobilization had created opponents whose strength grew continuously, while Japanese capabilities declined through irreplaceable losses. The mathematics were brutally simple. Every engagement that cost both sides, ships and pilots, ultimately favored America, which could replace losses while Japan could not. The strategic concept of decisive battle that had guided Japanese naval doctrine since Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima had become obsolete against opponents who could afford tactical defeats while building towards strategic victory. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, reflecting on his experiences during the final carrier battles, acknowledged the fundamental miscalculation that had shaped Japanese planning. They had assumed that American industrial capacity, while impressive, operated under similar constraints to Japanese production. The reality was industrial mobilization on a scale that no previous war had witnessed. American shipyards employed more workers building aircraft carriers alone than Japan's entire naval construction industry. Women comprised significant portions of American shipyard workforces, bringing millions of additional workers into war production. Assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing reduced construction times by factors that Japanese traditional methods could not match. The standardization that American industry embraced allowed unprecedented efficiency gains that multiplied effective capacity. Every component of American carrier construction was designed for mass production using interchangeable parts and simplified assembly procedures. Japanese construction, emphasizing individual craftsmanship and unique improvements, required skilled workers whose expertise could not be rapidly expanded. The human cost of this industrial disparity became apparent in the final months of the Pacific War. Japanese naval aviation, reduced to suicide attacks, sacrificed remaining pilots in desperate attempts to inflict damage on American forces whose losses could be immediately replaced. The kamikaze campaigns represented the ultimate admission that conventional tactics had become hopeless against industrial superiority. American forces, supported by continuous reinforcement and replacement, could absorb kamikaze attacks while maintaining operational capability. Task forces that suffered significant damage simply withdrew for repair while replacement units continued operations. The industrial foundation supporting American naval power provided strategic resilience that no amount of individual sacrifice could overcome. The final accounting of carrier production revealed the magnitude of Japanese miscalculation. Between December 1941 and August 1945, American shipyards delivered 147 aircraft carriers of all types to the fleet. Japanese production during the same period totaled 22 carriers, including conversions of existing hulls and vessels, completed but never operational due to lack of aircraft or trained crews. The production ratio of nearly 7-to-1 represented industrial superiority that extended beyond mere numbers to fundamental differences in strategic approach. American carriers were designed for mass production and acceptable losses in sustained operations. Japanese carriers represented individual engineering achievements intended for careful preservation and decisive engagement under favorable conditions. The escort carrier program alone exceeded total Japanese carrier production by overwhelming margins. 114 escort carriers were completed by American shipyards, each capable of operating 20 to 30 aircraft in tactical formations that multiplied their effective impact. These ships, initially dismissed by Japanese intelligence as unsuitable for fleet operations, provided the numerical foundation for American naval supremacy across multiple theaters simultaneously. The technological sophistication of late-war American carriers demonstrated industrial capacity applied to continuous innovation. Ships completed in 1944 carried radar systems, communication equipment, and aircraft handling facilities that exceeded the capabilities of any other navy. Mass production had not compromised quality, but had instead enabled systematic improvement through standardized procedures and shared technological advancement. Japanese naval officers, interrogated after surrender, consistently expressed amazement at American logistical capabilities that supported sustained carrier operations far from base facilities. Task forces operated for months, without returning to major ports, supported by fleet trains that provided fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement aircraft on schedule that maintained combat effectiveness, regardless of distance from home bases. The contrast with Japanese logistics was stark and demoralizing. Japanese carriers required frequent returns to major naval bases for replenishment and repair, limiting their operational flexibility and exposing them to submarine attack during transit. The industrial infrastructure supporting sustained operations simply did not exist within Japanese capabilities. Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38, operating continuously in Philippine waters during October and November 1944, demonstrated American logistics in action. The force maintained 16 fleet and light carriers in operational status while conducting daily airstrikes, absorbing combat damage, and replacing losses without degradation in capability. Similar operations would have been impossible for Japanese forces, even at the height of their power. The industrial foundation required to support such sustained operations exceeded Japanese capacity by margins that naval planning had never anticipated. Every aspect of American carrier operations, from fuel consumption to aircraft replacement to crew rotation, operated on scales that Japanese logistics could not match. The psychological transformation in the Imperial Navy was complete by early 1945. Officers who had entered the war confident in Japanese technological and tactical superiority now understood that they faced opponents whose industrial capacity made victory impossible, regardless of individual performance or tactical innovation. The suicide attacks that characterized Japanese naval operations in 1945 represented acknowledgement that conventional warfare had become hopeless. When industrial capacity could replace American losses faster than combat could inflict them, traditional concepts of attrition warfare became meaningless for the inferior industrial power. Captain Yasumi Toyama, staff officer with the combined fleet, wrote in his diary about the impact of American carrier raids on Japanese home waters in July 1945. Task Force 38 operated with apparent impunity off the Japanese coast, launching airstrikes against industrial targets while Japanese naval forces remained in port, lacking fuel and aircraft for effective response. The sight of American carrier aircraft over Tokyo Bay represented the complete failure of every assumption underlying Japanese naval strategy. The waters that had once been protected by the combined fleet now served as operating areas for enemy task forces, whose strength exceeded the entire Japanese navy at any point during the war. The industrial statistics that Japanese intelligence finally compiled in preparation for surrender revealed the scope of their miscalculation. American aircraft production during the war totaled over 300,000 aircraft of all types. Japanese production reached approximately 76,000 aircraft, including training planes and obsolete models, unsuitable for combat against modern American equipment. The pilot training disparity was equally devastating. American programs graduated approximately 430,000 aircrew during the war years, maintaining pilot strength, despite combat losses, through systematic training that emphasized standardized procedures over individual excellence. Japanese programs, constrained by resource limitations and abbreviated instruction, could not replace experienced pilots lost in earlier battles. The final irony was that Japanese dismissal of American carrier claims had been based partly on accurate intelligence about individual ship capabilities. Early escort carriers were indeed smaller, slower, and less sophisticated than Japanese fleet carriers. What Japanese analysts failed to understand was that sufficient quantity becomes its own quality in industrial warfare. 100 escort carriers operating in coordinated task forces provided tactical flexibility and strategic resilience that no number of individual fleet carriers could match. The distributed capability that escort carriers represented made American naval operations virtually immune to single-point failures that could cripple more concentrated forces. The mathematical principles that governed industrial warfare had become visible through American carrier operations in ways that traditional naval doctrine could not accommodate. Victory belonged not to the force with superior individual platforms, but to the side that could sustain operations while replacing losses and maintaining technological advancement through systematic industrial processes. The legacy of Japanese naval miscalculation extended beyond military consequences to fundamental questions about national strategy in industrial warfare. Countries that could not match enemy production capacity faced inevitable defeat regardless of initial advantages in training, equipment, or tactical doctrine. The 100 carriers that Japanese admirals had dismissed as impossible propaganda became the foundation for American victory in the Pacific. Each additional carrier launched represented not just increased capability, but growing American confidence that industrial capacity could overcome any tactical setback or strategic surprise. The escort carriers that had seemed most vulnerable to Japanese criticism proved most decisive in establishing American naval supremacy. Their numbers allowed simultaneous operations across multiple theaters while providing tactical flexibility that concentrated forces could not match. The industrial philosophy that prioritized adequate capability in overwhelming numbers had triumphed over traditional emphasis on individual excellence. For surviving Japanese naval officers, the post-war years brought painful reflection on assumptions that had shaped their entire professional lives. The tactical doctrine that had achieved stunning victories in 1941 and early 1942 had become obsolete against opponents whose industrial capacity made traditional concepts of decisive battle meaningless. Admiral Ozawa, in his post-war memoirs, acknowledged that Japanese naval strategy had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor had been based on hopes of achieving decisive victory before American industrial advantages could become operational. The 100-carrier fleet represented the failure of that gamble and the inevitability of defeat once American production reached full capacity. The technological lessons were equally sobering. Japanese naval aviation had entered the war with arguably the world's best carrier aircraft and most experienced pilots. By 1945, American industrial capacity had produced aircraft that exceeded Japanese performance, while being available in quantities that made individual superiority irrelevant. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The Imperial Navy that had dominated the Pacific through superior training and tactical innovation was destroyed by opponents who had systematically overcome every Japanese advantage through industrial mobilization beyond Japanese comprehension. The final surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, took place within sight of American carrier task forces that represented industrial achievement beyond Japanese pre-war imagination. The 100 carriers that had been dismissed as propaganda were anchored in Japanese waters, testament to American production capacity that had transformed naval warfare forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The numbers that had seemed impossible in 1941 were proven conservative by 1945. American shipyards delivered not 100 but 147 aircraft carriers during the war, exceeding even their own ambitious production targets. The mathematical reality of industrial warfare had rendered individual excellence obsolete in favor of systematic production and replacement capability. Japanese admirals learned too late that dismissing American claims about carrier production was their most fatal error. The laughter of December 1941 had become the silence of total defeat, as escort carriers continued launching from American shipyards long after the last Japanese carrier had been sunk or scrapped. The 100-carrier fleet was real, operational, and decisive in ways that traditional naval doctrine could never accommodate. The industrial principles demonstrated through American carrier production would shape naval warfare for generations. Numbers mattered more than individual capability, when production could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The lesson was written in steel across Pacific waters, where American carriers operated with immunity, while Japanese naval aviation disappeared forever into the silence of industrial defeat.